Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get right started because we are, as Cami has mentioned a couple times, it's a tight day today and we're keeping everything moving. Thanks for joining us in this session on building resources for the network, which is about reuse impact calculators. I am going to go ahead and introduce everybody first, and then we'll jump right in. So maybe folks can wave. Tina Schaefer from the Washington Department of Ecology, Laura Novich from Hilo, and Liz Start, Reuse and Upstream Solutions Consultant, Start Consulting. All right. And my name is Emily Barker. I'm the Executive Director of Reuse Minnesota. So hello from the Midwest. We're excited to be involved here this year. I am going to kick this session off with a little bit of an overview of a study that we did a couple of years ago. That was an impact study. Whoop, where did my screen go? Hold on. There we are. That was an impact study on reuse as a whole. And I know this is the Repair Economy Summit. Our impact study looked more largely at the entire, what we consider the reuse umbrella. And so it included a few more things. So I'm going to go through this just real quick, and then I'll give, we'll move into each of our speakers sharing what they have worked on. Okay, so a little bit of background. In Minnesota, there have actually been 3 studies done. In 2011, the State Environmental Agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, did a study. And then in 2020, we did a study and then repeated or did another study in 2022. Both of our studies were funded through the Environment and Natural Resource Trust Fund, and all of these are available on our website, which I can provide a link to later. When we did the 2022 study, which is the one that I was involved with, we wanted to look at the definitions of reuse and kind of what the categories were. And so we looked at a lot of definitions, and I think some of our presenters today may talk about that, like how you calculate impact. You have to have a starting point, right? You have to know, are we talking about the same things, and make sure we're on the same page. So for this study, the definition of reuse that we used was the continued use, repair, or repurposing of items or materials, which extends the life of resources and decreases the demand for new production. And that last part was really key, we felt, in ours, because we wanted to make sure, so you'll see like cars are under rental. We recognize that most car rentals are not about decreasing the demand for new production. It's people going on vacation and renting cars, but on occasion, people do use rental vehicles to replace actually having their own vehicle. And so we have, I'll talk a little bit about how we calculated that later. These here are the categories that we kind of broke things down into when we purchased the data. And we're looking at, where to do calculations, what buckets to put all the data in. When we were, so as I think Washington, we'll talk about this, and others with their study and their work, a lot of the data is done using NAICS codes, which for folks who don't know what NAICS codes are, basically they are a type of identification code that businesses use to tell the world, the tax associate or folks, what they do. And so every business has NAICS codes, usually at least one, if not 2. And that's how we did the search to find the data that we were going to analyze. We looked at our 2020 inputs and did some further refining. One of the challenges, and this will come up, I think, a few times, is that the data is tricky at best sometimes to get reliant data. We're relying on imperfect inputs. Sometimes the NAICS codes for businesses don't actually match. They're not actually correct. I found this out with our own organization. The NAICS code that we were assigned has nothing to do with what we really do. But you can change them. Out of date data, missing businesses. I know personally, I was looking at businesses as I was going through them that I knew had gone out of business well before, like 6 years before the date. And so we knew that was an issue. And then duplication of revenue. And what I mean by that is sometimes we'd see a really small business, like a Goodwill in a small community, and the revenue it said they generated was clearly out of scope for what that small business was likely to have generated. And we realized it's because they were aggregating among like all of the Goodwills in the entire state. And so that's how the data was getting reported. So we had to figure out a way to kind of remove those outliers. Similarly, for employee counts, same kind of thing, where we knew the Goodwill in Willmar, Minnesota did not have 840 employees because the entire city has a couple thousand people. And so we had to do some hand data revisions and kind of quality control when we did that. The other thing I wanted to talk about that we did was we did some weighting. So when we took the data, looked at those different categories, we recognized that, you know, there are businesses that a portion of what they do is reuse, like a bookstore, but not everyone is dedicated completely to reuse, or like bridal stores where they are doing some rental, but the vast majority is probably new. And so we created these weightings. They were based on a number of assumptions. As I said at the bottom, it was an inexact science, but kind of like the cars, where it's like we said, it's a very small portion, and we had a different categories, different levels that we assigned to different types of businesses to essentially try to average out the actual economic and environmental impacts of each of the sectors. We also reintroduced some auto-related businesses, as I mentioned, related to rentals, which the previous study had completely excluded. Okay, so economic impacts that we found, and these are in ranges because of the way that our calculator worked. It kind of gave upper and lower estimations. So we estimate kind of somewhere in the middle that reuse has about $4 billion impact in the state of Minnesota every year. And we found that this was a lower than our 2020 calculations, but probably because of those weightings and the fact that we refined our data. So while it maybe doesn't look as good, we feel like it's a more accurate representation of what's happening in our state. The rental sector, maybe somewhat unsurprisingly, is the highest revenue of reuse businesses, just because of the type of things, you know, you're paying more for those types as a sector. And that the social value added from all of the different businesses about 2.4 billion. So taxes, wages, all of these aspects. Reuse is definitely a job creator for those of us in this space. I think that's not totally surprising. We found that it's probably somewhere around 40,000 jobs a year. Most are in the Twin Cities metro, which again, that's where our population is. So it makes sense that it's the primary place where the jobs are. And the most jobs are in repair. And at this summit, I think that also probably isn't super surprising, but they're often the most difficult to mechanize. It's, you know, unlike even resale, where we're seeing a lot of that going online, that's more difficult to do with repair. And so it's inherently more local. And so the vast majority or the largest portion of jobs were in the repair sector. I should mention that we did not include auto repair. So that we felt like that would skew the data so far, because most people are going to get their cars fixed instead of buying new cars. So there is no auto repair included in this. A few environmental benefits. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see obviously reuse and repair have huge environmental benefits. And most of that comes from preventing things from being extracted, right? We think a lot of us have been taught to think about disposal as kind of this environmental, don't fill up landfills, all of the litter, all of these problematic things, but the true environmental impact of most products is upstream. And so that's where these pieces come in most in kind of useful. Yeah. Takeaways. Reuse is a varied and significant part of Minnesota's economy. I know it maybe doesn't get the credit that it deserves, I think, partly because it is such a varied sector that sometimes we don't see ourselves as being this united sector. Data improvement is a priority, as is. I personally wouldn't recommend that this study be redone just because of the cost, less than every 5, maybe 10 years, because of how frequently the NAICS codes or the data is actually updated. You need a tool that allows for that nuance and that refinement, that cleaning up that I mentioned. And the big thing that we wanted to talk about was how we utilize this data. What's the point of even doing these studies? And I think that's where Tina and others will go into next, is we really wanted to use this data to advocate for reuse supporting programs. So for example, one thing that's not in here, but we found, is that reupholstery has some of the highest environmental benefit. And yet we know that most reupholsterers in Minnesota don't have capacity. They're totally, like, they have way too much work to do. And so that really should be something we're thinking about when it comes to job development and career, workforce development in the state, is how do we get folks into that sector, into that repair sector? Because there is so much environmental impact from heavy things like furniture. And, just the reality that we have prioritized recycling for much too long, and a shift to reuse and repair is needed. Okay, I know that was maybe a little bit longer, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Tina and have her share a bit about what she has worked on related to reuse impact.
Thanks, Emily. I am Tina Schaefer, she, her pronouns, and I work at the Washington State Department of Ecology with a small group called the Recycling Market Development Center. And we were created back in 2019 by the legislature out of the need from China Green Sword. And our legislature wanted us to start figuring out how to develop end markets here in Washington State. So we started to build this, unfortunately, without any lovely data, like Emily just showed. So we started to try to figure out, and as we developed our work, we realized that, we started looking essentially at glass and paper, these things that our legislators really wanted us to look at in the beginning. And we found that our work really focused on 4 core pillars, and that was doing the research, convening, bringing people together, providing technical assistance, and then looking at innovation. And so my work has really brought me to fall into the niche of innovation. And those are the people I find I am really loving working with. And that's where the real work is happening. And so with that innovation has come a program called Next Cycle Washington that began in Colorado and Michigan. And in 2022, it came to Washington, started in King County. And then last year, we made it a fully statewide program as the Department of Ecology took it over. And so we work with folks that are in the repair and reuse space, among others, with compost and things like that, and bring those people in on 6 months of training to focus on bringing their businesses up and getting them into the next level. And oh, thanks, Cami. And so while I don't have a beautiful data-filled report like Emily does, what I do have is Next Cycle. And I have those folks on the ground doing the work every day, showing the jobs created, the greenhouse gases reduced, and the materials kept from the landfill. And what I was hearing from them routinely is that they do not have a way to measure these materials and to show the great work that is being done. We are being told time and again to use our environmental protection agencies, the EPA's, the WARM model, to measure these items and this data. And it just does not work for the types of things that they are trying to measure. You can't measure toasters and refrigerators and tons of textiles kept from the landfill for things that are meant for tons of steel. And so that's where Cami and I came in and teamed up with Laura, who's going to talk here in a moment, to create our own reuse impact calculator to be used here in Washington and spread to whomever would like to use it. It will be totally open for whoever wants to use it. And we'll provide that to our repair and reuse community so that they can more easily really get the measurement and tell that story of the items that they are keeping from landfill. And that in turn, the reason why ecology is getting behind that, it will help us tell the story to our legislators to get more funding for things like Cami mentioned earlier, to for policy such as an EPR program, potentially with vouchers. So that's why ecology is really behind this, to help get those policies in place and tell that story and get future funding. And I think that is my story, my part of it all. Liz, what did I miss?
I think you did great.
All right. Laura, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. So to kind of jump on that real quick, there's two main things that I want to say that were pointed out in general is that it's really hard to quantify reuse and repair. It's really hard, right? It's very subjective. It's dependent on so many variables and factors, depending on where you are, what type of community it is, all of those boundaries. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that it's not important to measure. And so that's what we're trying to do here is find a way to measure it that everyone can so that it will be accessible to everybody. So I've worked on building an impact calculator for the Department of Sanitation in New York, and a little bit of a different scope in terms of who was using it. And one of the hardest parts of working with organizations that were reuse organizations was telling them or helping them define what reuse actually was, which, you know, what you were just talking about before, Emily, but how do you tell a social service organization that's accepting clothing that they are reusing, that they are participating in reuse when they're not identifying as that? They're just saying, oh, well, this is what we have to do because this is what our programming is. So how do you start identifying them as that? That was a really hard part. And so it just keeps snowballing from there of all of these different obstacles and things in your path to try to quantify it. So what we want to do though is create a system where all of these organizations that are doing things in a little bit of a different way can come together and have a uniform system where it is a universal language. Things are kind of created at level so that they can start comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges and not using the WARM model. We did use the WARM model in the very beginning for our impact calculator, and to say it nicely, it's garbage for products. It's good for certain things. I think for like vegetative, big mass quantities of like raw materials, it's fine, right? But for a textile, it's not. It didn't have any of those components. So we were kind of piecemealing things together to get it a material, to get a product to have some type of quantification, the impact at the end. But there's more work to be done, and beyond what that impact is, the calculation at the end, the real hard part is being able to get all of the data in one place from all of these organizations so that they can even understand, in comparison from what they're all doing. Because from my personal experience of working in this field and also speaking with brands, not reuse, but brands that are in the new part, community and hyperlocal reuse and repair are a huge factor in combating any type of like climate change or changing anything like that, creating more jobs. And so we need to provide this platform to allow them to be able to do their job and to do more of it, because I think that as we see in the next few years, having more of a grassroots effort and community is going to be even more important. So now is the time. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I have done and where we are.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. Liz.
Thank you. Just based off of what Laura was sharing, for next cycle, we worked on a study called the Circular Resilience Map and really found, even especially coming after the presentation earlier today, how local reuse and repair and the share economy builds local resilience. So just putting that in there, but that's a different presentation. So I'm Liz Sturt. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with Sturt Consulting Group. I used to run a national creative reuse nonprofit, so very passionate about it. And really, when I got into consulting, really tried to be an advocate, especially for groups doing this work and in the trenches, so to speak, working so hard to keep materials in the reuse, repair, and share economy. So I have a few slides to share with y'all. And this is just based on some studies that I've done and some work. So in 2021, I worked with the city of Portland to do a reuse, repair, and share needs assessment. So we did multiple focus groups and small group interviews. And one of the things that bubbled up was really the need for data tracking and metrics. I know for the nonprofit that I ran, we were able to get some funding by reporting our weights to a local government, and we were able to get funding through that. So that was very cut and dried, where we were able to just weigh the materials, but we know there's so many other metrics that need to be considered. So this was really early on in my consulting work of just saying, like, hearing from all these groups, hey, we need a system. Some folks do item count, some people track by pounds, some people track by tons, which I'm going to go on a quick sidebar of I get really frustrated when we talk about tons too much in reuse and repair and share, because it is so localized and personal that I think it's really important that we look at the different levels that meet the needs of organizations and then figure out on the back end how to collect that data. Another study that I did was working with bulky items. So we looked at what reuse and repair was being done for large household items, and just wanted to share, this is not like super scientific data. This was just based on a high level survey, but just to give you an idea of kind of the need to collect this data. Obviously Goodwill is collecting a lot of stuff and for reuse, and a lot of great work that's being done. I'm in Oregon, and so this is in our Portland metro region. But as you can see, some folks track by pounds, some we converted to tons, and then we have folks who are doing item counts. Other metrics too. This is the breakdown of what are the large household items. So there's also multiple layers of reuse. And then two, tracking this data would really help nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations understand what materials to collect, what are people needing. So there's so much positive stuff that can go into this data. Another thing we looked at too was the barriers. And so by getting the data down and be able to, get our arms around the data of what's being collected, what type of greenhouse gas impacts, climate impacts are being had. We're also looking at what the barriers are and how to address it. And so you can really do that with data. For example, a lot of organizations have to charge for pickup because it costs them money to do this. So we were able to kind of get an understanding of what was happening there. And then, two, I think this is really important. A lot of times organizations get saddled with people's garbage. It's not garbage that they're generating, it's from people's homes. And, we got feedback that organizations were paying anywhere from $1,400 a month to $250,000 a month in garbage because they were getting unusable items donated. But that's really important data to have too, and not necessarily with the reuse impact calculator, but getting an understanding will also help with that education side of things. So there's so many benefits to being able to collect this data. And then lastly, the most recent project that I worked on in my region, the Portland metro region, we just closed a regional reuse and repair survey. So really just trying to understand what's going on in our region using those NAICS codes, like Emily said, really just trying to get our local government connected to reuse and repair, not just nonprofits, but also businesses that are doing great work there. And, this will help our regional and local and state governments understand how to invest in this work. So there's a lot that's being done, but I'm really excited about the reuse impact calculator that Tina was talking about and the work that Laura's done. We're all like nerding out to work with Laura on this project. Because there's a huge need. And I think if you run a reuse or repair or share organization, you probably face those same challenges of how do you collect that data? What data should you collect? Who gets the data and what do you do with it? So it's important that we start to build momentum around that so we can start to address a lot of these issues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liz. I completely agree that the data it's so critical for informing how we move forward in what we want to invest in. I want to check and see, since we have about 5 minutes until the next session starts, I want to just take questions first from the audience. If not, I've got a few other things we can chat about. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to just come off mute if you want to ask them. All right, well, I'll go ahead and move into a couple. I guess one question that I think we've touched on a little bit, but and feel free for any of the speakers to jump in. how you see impact studies like this or impact data being used positively to help direct government investments, whether that's education, pathways to repair, mentorships, apprenticeships, grants, what opportunities you see and kind of, or things that you already see happening. Because we know, that money does make things helpful or, moves things forward when it comes to advancing this. So opportunities that you see or things that opportunities, I guess, with the data that we have to support those things.
I
Go
can
ahead.
speak. Yeah, I can speak a little bit, at least from my perspective. Ecology is very good at doing studies. We do a lot of waste characterization studies to see what's going in the landfill in Washington. But, it's focused on your very traditional materials. And I think reuse and repair is left out, at least it has been. And so this is the bringing the reuse impact calculator to Washington is a way to highlight that community and what is going on in that community, because we can make a lot of policy decisions and decide what we think is best, but without actually hearing from the community and their wants and their needs. To me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to just make those decisions. So I think, they're out there and like we were saying, they're gathering this data and a lot of them in a lot of different ways and then not knowing what to do with the data. So having one standardized way to gather the data and then to tell the story and to bring it to the policymakers, that's going to be invaluable as we start to make more and more policies like right to repair and like EPR.
Just want to note that our Portland metro region with these studies and leading up to it, they have put before our Metro Council a $2 million annual fund called the Reuse Impact Fund to actually invest in reuse and repair and share organizations, not just as a grant funding mechanism. So actually investing in those organizations. And then, I think our governments, and private industry have invested so much in landfilling and recycling systems. And it's because it's such easy and clear data to capture. So if we can figure out how to get really strong data around reuse and repair and share, I think that will really help to when, we go to governments or go to folks like Tina, it just makes her have a stronger case for budgets, et cetera.
Thanks, Liz. I don't know about everybody else, but I just got the pop-up saying the rooms are going to close. But Rosemary, what if you have a real quick, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rosemary. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. I'm kind of salivating here over the things that you're doing. Although I run the Share Reuse Repair Initiative. It's a nonprofit. In short, we have helped Metro Vancouver here, integrate reuse into their transfer stations. We looked at bulky household items. I think the metrics are key, and we're doing a Share Reuse Repair action guide for Canadian municipalities. So I want to follow up with a bunch of you guys because a lot of our waste management entities are run by engineers, and to get them to